All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Latano. I'm the Vice President of PTCMW. I am excited to kick off our August event, which is an expert panel discussion and interactive workshop on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in organizations, and really with a focus on moving from being reactive to more proactively establishing a DEIB strategy. Before introducing our panelists, I am going to ask a rather odd favor. I did warn the panelists already, so they probably are either laughing or keeping a straight face. I can't tell, but it's been a while since we've updated the pictures on our website. So for those of you who are feeling camera ready today, do you mind taking a minute to turn your cameras on while I take a screenshot for our website? I appreciate you. And if you're feeling not camera ready, you can actually turn your camera off too. No pressure. Let's see. Awesome. Got it, as I'm sure you've heard in the background. And so now that I've officially made this awkward, let's turn the attention away from me and to tonight's agenda. First, we are going to learn from a panel of DEIB experts who I'm honored to introduce momentarily. We do have a little flexibility on timing, but we're shooting for about 60 to 70 minutes of discussion before we open up to audience Q&A at the end. We'll then take a short break, and around 5:45 p.m. Eastern time, I'm going to pass the reins over to Ruth Imos, Shannon Chang, and Davis Carlin from McKinsey & Company, who will lead us all through an interactive learning experience, really focused on implementing DEIB strategy. I'm honored to now introduce our expert panel. First, I'd like to introduce Sertrice Grice, the Chief Consulting Officer and co-founder of Mattingly Solutions. Next is Kelly Wilson, Senior Manager of EEO Compliance and Diversity at DCI Consulting. We're also lucky today to have Karen Young, who's the President of the Professional Adult, and Dr. Mahesh Subramani, who is Professor of Management at Northern Illinois University. Everyone, thank you so much for joining today. What I'd like to do is actually kick off with a more personal question before we dive into some of the strategic and logistical pieces. I'd like for each of you to share why you began working in the DEIB space and what it means to you personally. We'll start with Karen.
All right. Oh my goodness, welcome everyone. This is going to be a really exciting panel. To be very blunt, I got into the DEIB space because I got really tired of being the only person who looked like me in a space. My background is in advertising and product management, had worked my way up through management ranks, and just got really tired of being the person that everyone looked at to take notes, the person that everyone kind of looked at and was like, oh, you're leading the project? And I didn't want anyone else to experience that same sort of anger and frustration and feeling small. So by me moving into the DEIB space, if in some small way I can help someone else who is coming up behind me, then I feel like I've done something good.
I'll go next.
Yeah, Kelly, yeah, please, Kelly.
Wasn't sure if you were going to announce that. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be speaking today. I feel like mine was a little bit more of a natural progression and just my interest in school. As far as in graduate school, I just was gravitating towards the equity research and did my thesis on procedural justice in the workplace and how that impacts people's you know, how it impacts their perception of equity within the workforce with other opportunities. But I would also say that growing up, my dad was a big influencer of how we should be treated in the workforce, and he fought for pay fairness, you know, pay equity, and safety of employees. So I think that was just embedded in me, and I just took it to a different level as far as just allowing just more acceptance in the workforce and breaking down barriers for all people. So I would say that. And then the third reason is I just really am passionate about the work that I do and setting a good example for my kids and showing them what and how we should be treating other people, and especially in the workplace when it has such great impact on people's lives.
I'll go next. Sorry, finding the mute button there. Welcome everyone. Happy to be here. So my background is in industrial organizational psychology, and before I was at Mattingly Solutions, I was at a survey company called Org Vitality. And last year, when everything in society started to get a little intense, I took it upon myself to do some things internally. I had some listening sessions where we talked about anti-racism, and then from there realized, we were partnering with outside organizations, but we didn't have anything set up internally. So I formed a D&I task force, and we were doing some things both internally and externally. I then became the kind of survey expert. We had a lot of clients coming in and wanting this work done. And I realized that I was really enjoying being in that space. It was rejuvenating for me, and I was excited to help them versus the broader survey space. And like I said, it also had an impact on me personally. I was having the conversations I started internally were because it did impact me. And I had colleagues coming to me and asking for advice, both about what to do in their personal life and professionally. So from there, that's where I realized I was going to do a slight pivot change, and what got me on my path here at Mattingly Solutions.
Thanks, folks. I'll go next. I think for me, the interesting diversity and inclusion really comes from my students, specifically Ruthie Mose, who is on the screen right now. She and Ariel Rogers, also one of the members of your organization, and I were engaged in a couple of projects a few years ago. And that's what really got me from a research perspective into diversity inclusion. But really from a personal perspective, it's that lived experience of being different, I guess, and also just empathy toward folks, just trying to understand the lived experience of others. What is it really like to be different, and what does it feel, and what can be done really to include people's voices into discourse? I guess that's really what brought me into D&I.
Thank you all for sharing some personal experiences as well. Really appreciate that. What we're going to do now is actually, because this is a DEIB focused panel, I think that we'll start off by actually talking about diversity itself. When we're talking about diversity in organizations, what are the different types of diversity we should be considering and talking about? And then what are the impacts that we should be thinking of diversity on different indicators of performance? And we'll start with Kelly here.
Great, thanks. And I love this panel because we're all going to have diverse answers, and that's what I'm expecting. My background really comes from workforce equality, and so we deal with a lot of measurement of different metrics. And so a motto that we always say is what gets measured gets done. And so we take the approach of making sure you have the data points necessary to measure diversity within the organization, and that can be a wide range of factors, right? We focus on race, ethnicity commonly, as well as sex, but we also look at the intersectionality of those two fields. We collect information on disabilities and veterans. Age, of course, is a major factor of something that we would utilize to measure how diverse an organization is. But also just other data points, right? The perceptions of how people are feeling through exit interview information that we gather from companies, or complaint investigations that we've been privy to under attorney-client privilege, or engagement survey feedback. So all of that information tells us a big story about the diversity of an organization. But I will say, again, whatever you are going to measure within a workforce, and it's all important, just make sure you have the right data points to measure that over time, and to tell a story, and to then help remove barriers that you identify for the company. So again, my perspective is unique in that it's looking at measurement for other organizations, and I look forward to my colleagues sharing a little bit more about their perspective on what diversity should be incorporated in this discussion.
Karen.
I am happy to jump in on this one. So everyone talks about the big three for diversity, and that is race, gender, and orientation. Those are the big three. But one thing that I am finding with clients, and I'm really excited to talk about, are other vectors of diversity: parental status, veteran status, neurodiversity, location, religion, different types of disabilities, especially invisible disabilities. So all of these vectors of diversity are really fascinating in looking at how do we create a just and equitable and accessible world and environment for folks. It's not just the big three. And having conversations with folks, especially when you're having conversations around privilege, and you have folks who are like, well, you know, I don't have privilege, or folks who are like, well, we're all privileged in different ways. I love having conversations with clients that, you know, I have size privilege. I can easily walk into any store and purchase clothes. I don't have to worry about those kinds of things. That absolutely is a privilege. And so when we're looking at different types of diversity, we need to look at all of these different elements that make us fully human, as opposed to just looking at the ones that we've been looking at for years previously. So I'm excited to dig into those levels of diversity and how we can still create accessibility and an equitable world for everyone that way.
Yeah, and Mike, I'm going to chime in just one small add, and that's a reminder that diversity is not an individual level measurement. A person is not diverse, a group is. So when speaking about diversity, not only, I love that they call out, you know, there's more than just the big three, but also it's going to look different based on your organization. Your minority or majority is going to vary. So just wanted to throw that quick add out there.
Very good. And as we really start to think about the impact of diversity on different indicators of performance, you know, what should we be thinking about there? And I'll actually start with Mahesh, if you don't mind.
Yes, absolutely. So when we think of diversity and its effect on performance, I was just doing a little survey of the different studies that have been done in that area. And interestingly, there are about 8 meta-analyses linking diversity and performance. And in general, what we are finding is that diversity is not just this monolith, right? So Karen's point about the big three, I think there is this sort of feeling within academics that diversity is this one big one, right? And in general, what we are finding is that that's really not the case. It depends on the kind of diversity. And in general, when you think of, you know, functional diversity, so things like, you know, years of experience within the organization, tenure, for instance, or you know, which different department you're in. If you look at those kinds of diversity measures, we are seeing this positive relationship between diversity and performance. But when it comes down to race specifically, and also gender to some extent, we are either finding mixed results, neutral results, or very small negative effects on performance at the unit level of analysis. So really the discourse has shifted away from does diversity have an effect on performance to, you know, what kinds of diversity in what kinds of contexts has a relationship with performance. I think that's the bigger question here. And folks are looking at a bunch of different you know, contextual measures, and I'd be happy to talk about those as we move on.
Yeah, I'll add on there too. So historically, you know, there have been a lot of statements, a lot of blanket statements made that diversity does help, especially like it increases innovation, people perform better, they're happier. And there's a famous study that is often referenced. It's done by McKinsey, and that one now has famously been looked at, and people are like, we can't replicate this. So it shows the importance of, while data is important, trying to replicate studies, but that's a whole nother conversation. But in trying to replicate it, what people have been looking into as well is the importance of inclusion. So having diversity alone is not what actually is having the impact. It's also important to have an environment where these people feel welcome, included, valued, seen, heard. And once you have that full picture, that's when they start seeing the benefits and the returns coming in. And I'm saying this broadly because, again, like Mahesh mentioned, it's still being studied. But in theory, once you have all of this, not just diversity, not just the numbers, but having that safe environment, that's where you start to see the benefits and performance and people performing at higher levels.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And I love, you all are making my role as moderator very easily as you really tee me up well. We're talking about bridging the gap between science and practice as we talk about, where this research really is. We talked a little bit too about the big three of diversity and how organizations are focusing on gender, race, and orientation. But in addition to that, how are organizations talking about diversity, and how does that differ from how they should be talking about it?
Well, I feel, and I'll hop in here, I feel like a lot of organizations are still a little stuck. They're still a little stuck in the sense of, I need a checklist of what are the 5 things that I need to accomplish to build a more diverse environment. There are tons of blog posts and books that'll tell you, 15 steps to whatever. And I think that the way that people should be looking at it, and I think Satrice set it up beautifully, is how do you look at a person holistically? How do you look at your organization holistically? What are the pieces and parts you need to make sure people are seen and heard and valued? And that can look differently to everyone. And so the goal is to be agile, to use another thing that's fairly popular right now, be agile in the way that you think about diversity. So I try something, maybe you're looking at, your survey results and it pulls you in one direction. You try it for a while. How have you measured it? Was it successful? No, make some tweaks here and look at it another way. But again, your goal should be, how do you make sure everyone is seen, heard, and valued? Those are the goals of inclusion, not necessarily diversity. Diversity is just pretty much ticking off boxes. You want to make sure that people actually feel like, yeah, we want you here.
Yeah, I agree. That's great insight, Karen. I agree with the holistic approach. So when we are working with organizations, when you get it right, you take a workforce in total view of the organization, and you look at everything from not just the representation, but why is there a gap in representation in comparison to labor force statistics? Is it because you are not attracting the right talent pool? Can you do more there? Are you not promoting talent at the same rate as other talent? Are you losing that talent because your culture doesn't allow for you to keep them there? And then you get at the bigger picture by like what I said earlier, by looking at other data points, looking at why are they leaving the organization? Are managers implementing policies and procedures in the manner in which they were developed? Can you gather that information anecdotally from employees and managers? Looking at it holistically from a pay, attraction, hiring, promotion, termination, a qualitative stance is the way to go to get at the full story of how an organization can be more inclusive to diversity and inclusion. And so not just solely focusing on representation, which is a big driver right now, especially since last year, is what do we look like and how can we be better, and let's set some goals. But it's not just looking at those goal setting opportunities, but is it working, and why or why not is that working for your organization and making change?
And if I could just add something just really quickly, as part of like that representation, a lot of organizations are looking at the beginning part of that funnel, the attraction, the sourcing, the hiring portion. If I can be very blunt with y'all, retention is more important than hiring. Keeping the people you have, making sure they're happy, is much more important than trying to bring people in. If once your people are happy, you will get people in. So the representation and getting people in the door, sure, great. It's the inclusion that keeps them. So focus on that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. So for me, what I see a lot is traditionally it has been a numbers game, and it's looking at diversity, how many people are we bringing in, and very focused on that selection piece. And then after everything, again, recently, right, we can't ignore 2020. 2020 was real. And with that, everyone was like, okay, we have to make a statement because we need to be on the right side of history, and we need people to know that we're not bad. And so it became very focused on, all right, we're going to put out a statement, we're going to slap on an unconscious bias training, and we're good to go. And so organizations were taking this approach of just assuming they knew what they were doing, honestly. Like they were like, we just need to get something out there and then we're done. Check that box, move on. And so when I'm correcting them and trying to get them to focus on this in the right way, is just to slow down. That's always my advice. Is I love, like Kelly, I love data, right? So taking a data-centric approach, looking at all of your data, so throughout the entire employee life cycle, like Karen was getting at, and then also getting that employee voice, so surveying them, and we'll touch on that more later, but figuring out, what's the perception, how are they experiencing in that environment, then developing a sound strategy based on that data before jumping into that last piece of acting, right? And then one more time, going back to data. Did our actions actually have an impact, and doing that whole system. So not just checking your box, saying we have the numbers and moving on, but taking a holistic approach to this work.
Now, as we try to be a little bit more strategic in organizations, there's a lot of hypotheses going around, right, around things like mirroring the representation of the surrounding communities as a way to set goals for diversity. But what we want to do is we're bridging that gap between science and practice, is really understand, what are some of the theories that academics have been researching and what has actually been found to date. And for that, I'm going to turn to Mahesh.
Thanks, Mike. I was actually just going to the different kinds of theories that are really out there, and ones that seem to be more cutting edge, for the lack of a better term. I think first there's this debate about the double-edged sword nature of diversity. So diversity can have a positive effect because it creates information pooling. So a bunch of people together in the unit, they are able to have a conversation with each other. There's multiple perspectives, and that's kind of the ideal state, right? Everybody is elaborating each other's knowledge and experiences, and that kind of leads to high levels of performance. So that's the positive effect, but there's this negative effect that we all know, right? So the biases, stereotyping, those kinds of things. So that tends to sort of slow down that effect. So one area where people are looking at the double-edged sword, specifically at what points do we see the positive effect, and what kinds of points do we see the negative effect. Second, you mentioned mirroring. So the idea that if you are catering to a customer base that's diverse, you need to have diversity in your employee base too. Is that really true? And interestingly, there are about 6 studies out there that really, there's 6 really good studies out there that look at mirroring, and about 3 say yes, it works, and 3 say it doesn't. True to IO psychology, we have to sort of look at the nuances. What are the specific contexts within which mirroring works, and what are the contexts within mirroring doesn't work? And in general, my research tends to show that when you have mirroring works if you also are looking at the non-linearity of diversity. That is, there is some optimum point beyond which just adding more, this is the Karen's point, just adding more, BIPOC people is not going to just lead to higher levels of performance. At some point in time, you have to consider what's happening when you're adding these people. Third, there is this work on what are known as diversity fault lines. And what that means is it's not just about the fact that somebody's Black or Asian or Hispanic or man or woman. It has to do with the number of identities that people have and how those identities are correlated with each other. And what we're typically finding is that the more the fault lines, the higher likelihood that you will have more of in-group affiliation as opposed to being affiliated to the organization. Fourth, very quickly, there is actually some conversation about intra-person diversity. So at this point in time, it's mostly theoretical, but folks are saying that, we have different identities. I have many years of experience, but I'm also Asian, kind of a deal, right? So what happens when you have multiple, diversity criteria within the same person? Does that make that person a better fit or a worse fit within different kinds of units? And does it have any effect on, things like job satisfaction, engagement, and performance? Those 4, I would say, are the key for those of you who are taking notes for thesis or dissertation research. I would say these 4 are the main areas that researchers are looking at. And obviously, there are about 16 more that I've missed.
Very good. Anyone else want to add anything on any of the theories that are going around or what's been found to date, or bridging the gap between science and practice before we move on to something else? Okay. One key topic that we have touched on, but really not dug into too deeply yet, is really taking this data-centric approach to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So first, I'd love to ask everyone, what are some of the different ways that we can collect data and really understand the experiences of all people, and what pitfalls should we be watching out for as we do? And we'll start with Certrice there.
In my area, the route that we tend to take is looking first objectively. So what are some hard numbers that exist? And so, like we started talking about previously, diving in, what when you're recruiting, what's the breakdown of the demographics of who you're recruiting, but also who's doing the recruiting and the places you're recruiting at. So a full look at that. Then into selection, who are you actually selecting, your actual workforce, who's being promoted, who's leaving, so looking at your turnover numbers there as well. So basically the entire employee life cycle, getting a view of that demographic breakdown. And then from there, wanting to also then look at getting that employee voice. I touched on this a little bit earlier, and that is getting that in two different ways. So one would be quantitative. You can quantify people's feelings. That's why we have surveys. So getting those surveys out there and finding out how do they feel, are things equitable, are they getting experiences, do they think people are treated differently based on demographics, what are they experiencing in the environment. But I will say, no matter, and this is coming from me as an IO psychologist who makes these items, they can lead to more confusion than answers sometimes. So while it's important to get that quantitative data to know, what's going on in your environment, we then follow up with focus groups to get qualitative data to find out why. So having a conversation and saying, these are the data points we were finding for this group, and it's concerning to us. That's why we want to meet with this targeted group. And having them then elaborate on what might be happening there, because it's very easy for us to read something and assume, oh, this must be how they interpreted it. And then once you have these focus groups, a lot of times it's actually different. So your employees are a rich data source that often is overlooked. So highly recommend just giving them a chance to speak. They want to be happy, right? They want to be happy at work. So if you give them the chance to give you feedback, they will give you something that's valuable, and it'll help you direct and know where to focus your efforts to have the most impact.
Great.
I
Awesome.
do. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kelly.
I'm sorry. I thought I was next.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Real quick, I agree with everything that Certrice said. It depends on why the company is coming to us. And so first thing that we typically do is ask a question of why. And that helps, it kind of blends into a needs assessment question for us is, why are you coming to us? Is this like, are you post-litigation? Are you proactively wanting to do the right thing? Do you have an internal concern due to some engagement survey results or something else? So why are you coming to us, and what kind of buy-in do you have in the organization from the top levels? Because that's going to tell us how invested you are in this, and potentially what services we would put in front of you as opportunities for you to address the concern. But if it was our choice, we would do a holistic approach for every corporation, in which we would do a qualitative and a quantitative approach to our review. And it would be inclusive of everything from, we would start with like a labor force comparison. So yes, we would love to have 50% females and 50% males in every single job, but in reality, what does the labor force census, what does the Census Bureau say is who, what is the percent of people that were qualified to do certain jobs in your organization? And do you even meet that level, whether or not it's 50% or not? Do you even meet the who is qualified in the labor force to do these jobs? And if not, that's definitely an opportunity immediately for you to address. But then also going into that holistic approach where we talked about looking at job seeker pools, applicant pools, because we know in certain companies that's different, right? Who candidates are versus who applicants are could be different for some corporations. Who's promoting, who's terminating, and getting that full story. But we also look at pay equity and whether we see a consistent concern, not only in who's promoting, but potentially in how we're paying them in that process as well. And the other qualitative piece is getting those full focus group discussions to really understand the implementation of certain policies and procedures from a manager perspective, as well as from an employee perspective, to see if there's a story to connect things that are concerning maybe in the data analytics side versus what we're seeing in a qualitative side. And so taking that holistic approach is really important to get at the full story and to really make change for these organizations. And of course, not leaving them empty-handed, but providing recommendations that are based in research best practice would be an opportunity for kind of closing that out. And to Satrice's point, always following up and measuring that over time. So that's that would be kind of how we would approach it from a data perspective. And I'll hand it over to you, Karen, to go next.
Thanks so much, Kelly. So yeah, I completely echo everything that Satrice and Kelly said. That's how we do it here at the Professional Adults. It's almost exactly the way that we do it at the Professional Adult. I will, however, say that I would like to caution folks not to over-rotate on the quantitative. A lot of orgs are just looking for the hard numbers and looking for, well, how am I doing stacked up to everyone else? How are my numbers compared to everyone else? Numbers don't tell a narrative, and we're human beings. We live and die by narrative and story. And if people really want to be seen, heard, and valued, you have to figure out their story. So that's where focus groups come in. I even drill down and I do one-on-one interviews. I use a lot of, human-centered design principles, and I actually just do one-on-one interviews with folks to really dig down into their story. Sometimes in focus groups, it's a little hard to get some voices in the room itself. So drill down and have that conversation with people. What is your story? Why are you here? What drives you? What motivates you? What do you want to see? Who are you? And asking those questions can help to build your organization.
Mahesh, anything to add here, or?
Yeah, just a quick comment that when we're looking at quantitative measures, I think it's important to also think of linkages. So this idea of linkage research is really important. So when you're collecting any data, looking at it at the unit level of analysis and then connecting it with employee turnover, customer satisfaction, financial performance, and sort of quantifying those links matters. So when we think of hard numbers, a lot of times we're focused very much on the individual level of analysis or just kind of descriptions, right? Do we have parity, or are we having representation? Those kinds of questions. I think we need to go beyond that to take survey data as well as these quantitative data and then connect them directly statistically to performance measures. And I see there's a lot of value in there. And to Satrice's point, as well as Karen's point, you can tell a story using those numbers when you're able to say, 1% increase in this leads to a 0.5% increase in that kind of a thing. So just something to kind of keep in mind as you're creating a measurement system.
Yeah, we've naturally talked a little bit about some of the potential risks of focusing in on the quantitative only or the hard numbers only. But what other blind spots or bad practices do organizations have when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and measurement and evaluation? And we'll start off with Karen here.
I kind of go back to my original point, and I am very practical in how I approach DEI. I'm sure I have some clients say almost to a fault, but it's not linear. DEI work is not linear. There's no magic formula. We absolutely have best practices, but there isn't a 10-step guide to DEI success. And there needs to be a level of bravery and vulnerability that you have as a team, as an organization, as a person, to be able to engage in this work. And so one of the blind spots I see is that inability to be brave and vulnerable and engaging in the work, and to really see where the gaps are, even when they are uncomfortable for the members of the organization. Like, no one wants to hear your pay equity is terrible. No one wants to hear this group of people are leaving because they feel like they're being workhorses and not valued. No one wants to hear that. But you have to be brave enough to hear it, to be able to confront it, to be able to change it. So that's the biggest blind spot, is just a lack of bravery and also the desire for a checklist.
Yeah, I'll go in a slightly different direction. I think one of the blind spots for a lot of companies, especially what we saw in 2020, is the quick action to pledge to certain things without knowing and having the infrastructure to support some of the pledges that they committed to. And not that that's, it's great that they want to commit, but having the infrastructure to build upon it and to act on it, but arbitrarily setting goals without understanding their practices and whether they can retain that talent if they're going to say they're going to increase representation by so much because they pledge to to the public. That could be a blind spot for a lot of organizations, because you're setting yourself up for a couple of things, right? You're either going to work really hard to attract that talent and to hire them, but you're not going to support them and you might lose them on the back end, or you set yourself up to not be able to attract that talent because talent may not be at that level qualified in the labor force market, even looking at graduation rates or something else. So I think you have to be well educated to know what those labor force statistics look like and to have the infrastructure to support what you're actually committing to. So I think that would be a potential blind spot for companies, blindly pledging certain commitments without understanding a little bit further. And I think just the education piece of pay equity, and I think a lot of companies are starting to come out and say what their wage gap is, and I think understanding really what the wage gap is, and that a lot of the 82 cents to $1 difference for females to men, and never mind the intersectionality of other diverse groups, a lot of that's the distribution of where they sit in the organization. And so throwing money blindly to fix a problem that's not necessarily a pay equity and job, it's more of a distribution of people in the organization at the top levels and the higher paying jobs is a blind spot for some companies, if they're if they're pledging to do better and they're trying to commit to doing this, but not having the full understanding of what some of those raw statistics mean and how it applies to their workforce.
Yeah, and I want to add on one more thing from a measurement perspective, well, two. One is, for the academics in the room, I know this is going to hurt your heart a little bit, but when it comes to I&D work, we have to kind of loosen our guidelines around our idea of power a little bit. 9 times out of 10, if you are trying to help your underrepresented groups, they're going to be small. And sometimes organizations will say, well, we only have a handful of people in that group, so we can't do anything for them. It doesn't matter if there's one person, you still need to do this work. You need to dig in, collect the data, find out their experience and help them, because even if it's one person, that work matters. It's valuable. And then something that, the other point I wanted to make that kind of amazes me is that people will go as far as trying to collect data, but then they won't break it down, right? And maybe it is because of or they just think it's okay at a high level. And so they look at this survey data or something at just the overall, and they're like, yep, we're doing well. Everyone is happy here. Everyone is happy to work here. But without breaking it down, you're missing all those nuances. So again, let's go back to the idea of, let's say you have 5 people, 5 Black women, right? I'll pick on myself. Yeah, you got 5 of us out there. And if you don't break that down to see, maybe they scored it at, 40%. But if it's 5 out of 1,000 people, you're not going to see that. That's not going to impact your overall number enough for you to realize there's a problem. So one, make sure you're cutting down to those levels, because you're missing a lot. If you don't, you're missing half the story there. And 2, we got to stop worrying just about size of a group. If we're doing a research study, yes, you need that. Go collect all that you can. It'll give you the power to support the theory. But in a specific organization, you should not be ignoring any of your populations, whether that, and it's just a matter of how do you then anonymize it, right? And making sure you still protect those people, that is important, but you need to find a way to hear their voices.
When we were prepping for this session, we talked a lot about some of the pledges that organizations have made, and how a lot of organizations are responding really reactively. I'll leave it there and let you speak the rest of the way, so I don't bury the lead at all. But really, like, as we're talking about shifting from reactivity to proactivity in the DEIB space, there's a lot of questions of how do we do this right? How do we really proactively develop and implement actual D&I strategy as opposed to just trying to put out fires? And how can data either support or deter such a strategy? And I'm going to open it up to everyone, but I'm going to start with Certrice and then go to Mahesh, and then Karen and Kelly, you're welcome to add on as well.
Yeah, that's great. I love talking through this point. I mentioned this some earlier. A lot of times people just want to skip over to that, middle of the road piece of just throwing out their statement or doing unconscious bias training or creating a role, and it's important to first, again, slow down, get some measurement, and excuse me, more importantly, developing that strategy around it, right? So figuring out exactly what are our priorities going to be, because that's another thing that happens is there are a lot of well-intentioned people who go and they set forth and say, we are going to solve all of the world's issues today, and it's unrealistic. And when you go out there and you set these and you just, establish these lofty goals that are unrealistic, and then you don't meet them, that's how you lose support from your senior leaders. And that's also how you lose trust in your employees, because they don't see any action happening. So it's important first to do that measurement, find out what matters to everyone, what's important for your specific organization, and then developing that strategy, making a plan and laying out, okay, this is realistically what we can do in this amount of time and how we're going to measure our progress along the way before going out and trying to commit to this action. And that's going to leave you with a stronger impact. So I'll pause there for now. I could talk about this forever. I'll pass over to Mahesh.
Thank you, Certrice. I think I would say one step even before that, and that's really the business strategy. So when you think of any HR practice, the first thing that you have to do is to look at how does it help the organization create value, and doesn't just create value for shareholders, but its stakeholders. So you could be a nonprofit organization. So there the question is, how are you contributing to the mission of the organization, right? So first and foremost, we have to have the discussion around strategy, business strategy. And once we have that discussion around business strategy, that's when we start to think about how diversity and inclusion and belongingness sort of fits with that strategy. So we know it fits in many different ways, right? So for example, people, if you are inclusive, you also have high levels of engagement, for instance. But are there some specific types of things that your organization really needs to do in order to capture market share? So maybe that's where mirroring comes in, that you need to have a demographic profile of your workforce, which kind of looks like your customer profile. Those kinds of discussions have to happen first, I think. The second piece is the inclusive behaviors of leaders. It's one thing for leaders to say we need DEI or DEIB, but it's a completely different thing for them to actually practice that in their day-to-day work. So how a leader treats his or her people really matters. So if they are treating people in a way that sort of shuts them off, some of you might have actually seen this in your on YouTube about the specific airline based out of East Asia, and there's this woman who asks question of this senior leadership team, and the leaders essentially ridicule her. They make fun of her, they laugh at her. Those kinds of behaviors that sort of send a shudder through the collective spine of everybody watching it. But the idea, once again, is that leaders' behaviors, their championing behaviors, their inclusive behaviors really matter.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up leadership. That made me think of one other point. Mike, I know you had asked how can data either support or deter from that strategy? And I think sometimes people will lean too heavily on needing senior leadership buy-in and thinking that's where it needs to start. And senior leadership buy-in is important. They're the ones holding the pocketbook, right? So if you don't have it, and if they're not modeling, like Mesh was saying, if they're not modeling those behaviors, you're not going to make progress. But how do you get that support? And even if you don't have, without their support, maybe don't have the resources. So it's like chicken or the egg scenario. What I would say is if you're out there and you're passionate about it, you don't have that buy-in yet, you don't know where to start, but you want to kind of apply what we've been talking about, find the data you do have access to. I guarantee there is something you can find without too much extra expense. And if you can start with that picture and then put those numbers in front of senior leadership, that will help start gaining that buy-in, and then they'll give you more resources and you can get more data and have a more robust program. So just to say that it can be scary if you feel like you don't have the power and that you can't get started, but just starting with what you can manage and helping that shape the story to garner additional support, that data can really help you along the way.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in with a final note on this topic is, you know, given that we all like the data, one important statistic is understanding that the baby boomer population is way less diverse than the millennial population. And so just to sustain over time as an organization, there are things that they have to get right. Or I think their profits, their sales, their ability to attract and retain that talent is just not going to be there in the next, you know, in the near future. So I think keeping your, you know, Sister Teresa's point, having those statistics, telling the story, telling the bigger story, not just within the organization, but outside of the organization, what is going on that's going to impact us as an organization, and how do we sustain this long term? Well, just look at the changing demographics over time, and that's really important to keep in mind with as we start to kind of have workforce turnover naturally.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of organizations really need to think about diversity the same way that they would think about launching a new product in market, looking at building a new division. What is your goal? What is your North Star? What are you hoping to achieve out of this? Why are you doing this? Who are your competitors? What happens if you fail? And you answer all of these questions right off the bat, even before you start getting into measurement, because a lot of folks will measure and pull data where they have no idea why they're pulling data, but they're pulling data for the sake of I pull data. But you build it the same way you would build a product launch. Build it the same way you would build a campaign. Build it the same way you would if you're building a new division. Think about it in the same ways, the same questions, the same processes you would ask. Think about that when it comes to DEI work. There are things that you just don't need to do quite yet. Like you would never go to market with a full marketing campaign if you don't actually have a product. Like you wouldn't do it. Or if you did, it wouldn't always work. Treat DEI the exact same way. Why are you doing this? And I think that could help really reframe that for a lot of organizations who are so terrified and not sure what to do. Leverage the work that you're already doing. Use the tools and techniques you're already doing. The widget is changing, your process doesn't have to.
I love that. And I'm going to build on that as we really kind of think about, you know, what happens next. It's been a year to 18 months since everyone has truly felt and understood the impact of DEIB in organizations, and corporations really large and small have made ambitious public statements in support of equity and inclusion. But how do we generally and organizations sustain this momentum and continue to make progress in the right direction?
I can start. I think at least what I am seeing is I am seeing a little bit of contraction. I think a lot of people were so terrified to be on the wrong side. I think as Sutrice mentioned earlier, so many people were so scared of being on the wrong side of history. So they were just like, just throw something at the wall. Let's see what happens. They're now finding that their employees are now looking at them like, yeah, that didn't mean anything. And so instead of continuing to be brave and saying, okay, well, let's try something else, folks are starting to pull back and say, well, then I just guess it didn't work and we can just move on to something else. And so starting to see that a little bit of that retraction. And so what I would like to see as part of the momentum is to, again, think about it like a campaign. That, yeah, this one may not have worked. What have we learned? What data did we learn in this first process that didn't work? And what can we take to now use into this next go round? Learn from the experience, take the data from the experience, take the data from your initial pull, and now how do we now move into phase 2? So that's what I would like to see as the momentum, is a little smarter work, a little bit more braver work, and continuing the work as opposed to being just kind of giving up and saying, well, it didn't work, so I'm not going to do anything.
I'll absolutely underline what Karen just said. I think the notion here is that of change management capacity. Can organizations really treat DEI like they would treat any other change? So make sure that there is a long-term plan, there are communication plans, there's a charter, a champion. If you're able to do it that way, and you are focusing on what I like to call the what's in it for me, the WIFM, very early on, if you're not able to do that, you're not going to have any momentum. And that deals with not just leadership, but across the organization. Additionally, with DEI, I think there's another little wrinkle, and that wrinkle is people who do not consider themselves to be the targets of DEI, right? So I'm not, African American or Hispanic, so I guess this is not something for me. I think that needs to go away, with inclusion being the larger umbrella within which we do DEI, that we want to hear everybody's voices, but we want to make sure that we are hearing those voices that we don't hear very often. I think that needs to be important within this larger change management initiative.
So Trace, do you want to go next? Okay, I'll jump in real quick. And one of the things for sustainability that we see from a workforce perspective is these corporate responsibility reports that companies are holding themselves accountable. So how transparent is a company being to the public about their initiatives, their progress towards those initiatives, and kind of pivot points of how do they continue to do more? And so I think there's a lot of push on companies to be transparent in all aspects of their workforce. And one way we're seeing it done in a more controlled environment is through those corporate responsibility reports, which have various names to them. But I think that's one way that you'll really be able to tell the companies that are taking this seriously and seeing their progress and seeing what they're reporting on through those reports is something that will help that sustainability, because companies will, the industries and shareholders and everyone's going to catch wind of what companies are doing, and they're going to hold companies accountable to it. So I think the more companies are transparent with some of their efforts to their employees and to the public, the more sustainable this will be over time.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and agree with what everyone else has said. One of my favorite things you'll hear a lot of DEI experts say is, it's a journey, not a destination, right? This wasn't going to be done overnight. It takes time. So just reminding ourselves of that, building a robust plan, strategy over years, right? It's not going to happen overnight. Being adaptable. So figuring out what's right, keep that going, figuring out what's wrong, making a pivot, and just knowing that that's okay. It doesn't mean that, you did anything wrong. It's just you have to try it to see if it's going to succeed. And then also, a lot of times in this work, we do just focus all the time on what's wrong. But a great way to sustain this momentum is to celebrate those wins. What did go right? What is helping? And highlight that, celebrate it. It's okay to celebrate the victories. We don't always have to live in that negative space. It's a balance though, right? Sometimes you have people who all they want to focus on is what we're doing well, or only celebrate when people do it right. And then you have people who only want to punish people when they do it wrong. So just making sure that you're marrying the two, because with both, that's that sweet spot where you have the most success.
Well, if any of you have been on LinkedIn anytime in the past 12 to 18 months, you've also seen a lot of external vendors claiming to be DEIB experts, and you've also seen probably more internal D&I roles posted than you've ever seen before as well. I know they're consistently flowing through my newsfeed, and I think that's really exciting because it does emphasize where the focus is in this space and where organizations are prioritizing some resources. Now, that being said, it's also really important to evaluate potential vendors and internal candidates for DEIB relevant roles and work. And so I'll pass to you all. How do you evaluate potential vendors and internal candidates as you're considering them for these types of roles?
Yeah, great question. So this is a really messy area, especially like you said, over the past year or so with everything going on. There's a lot of DEI experts popping up. So I would just say the same way before you hire anyone else, and something that we've talked about so far throughout this call is doing your research, right? Treating this like you would any other part of your organization. If you're going to bring someone in, vet them, don't just assume that person is Black so they know how to do the job because we're talking anti-racism. Look at, did they study anti-racism? Did they study a relevant field like psychology? What's their experience in what's their education in addition to their lived experience? Now, that being said, I will say also for external consultants, I know there's some of us on the call, partnerships are really valuable. And there are some things that you just need to know it's not where you thrive, right? For instance, if I was going to speak on the topic of disability, I would want to partner with someone who has a better experience there and can speak to that more. And so vetting your own partners and building a community amongst ourselves, there's enough work out there for all of us experts to thrive and have a business. And it also shouldn't just be about our pocket and our bottom line. If the people in this field really care about the work that we're putting out there, it's not about how much money I'm making. It's about how am I improving the lives of the people in these organizations. And that being said, again, it's okay to share our knowledge, right? And to partner together and lean on each other in spaces where we may not be the best suited person. It's also nice to have that community because this work is draining, right? So having those people that you can go lean on when you need that support as well. So that's on the external side. Similar thing happening on the internal side, right? A lot of people are like, oh, they said we need a D&I officer, so we're going to create one, and you're Black and you seem to care, so we're going to put you in that role. Black women. And I say that specifically because that is a lot of what I've seen on LinkedIn, in the news. It's oftentimes a Black woman because it's like, ooh, we're hitting 2 barrels there. And then we're going to check that box and we're done. Again, that's not great for the organization, because if that person doesn't truly know what they're doing, they're not going to be able to help and make the most of the program. But you're also setting that person up for failure, because when things go bad, now this Black woman is in a position where she can't do her job, right? And so that's how we start leaning and creating these biases again. And so it's really important that before you put someone in this role, to vet them, make sure they are really equipped to do the work, that they really want the role. And then one step further, when they're there, give them the resources. Let's say they maybe have some experiences, but not all of them, but they really are passionate about the work. Give them a chance, right? That's fine, but make sure they have all of the support they need to be able to succeed in this role. So it's about making sure they're experienced, they're interested, and then they have the resources to set them up for success.
So yeah, I definitely want to add on to that. And just again, talking about, and I love this word, I finally been working on it, the industrification of DEI. Yes. It really has become a hot industry. It has become a place where folks who have gone through, a certificate program, or someone who read a few books or whatever wants to hang out a shingle, and now they're an expert. So everything that Satrice said is 1,000% spot on. I also want to caution that education can sometimes be a bit of gatekeeping. So you also want to look at, have you built an ERG within your organization? Have you been a champion? Do you have the background experience? You may not have the formal title. You may not have a degree in the 3 or 4 places that we expect someone to have a degree in, but do you have the experience? Do you know what you are doing? And one good way of vetting someone, go talk to them. Ask them hard questions. See how they respond to things. Do they have a plan? Are they willing to ask you questions? Are they willing to say things like, well, it depends? And not necessarily be like, well, here's my 5 points. That look for those things as part of your vetting process. And also to put a very fine point on what Satrice said, cut a check. That is the support you need. Cut a check. Sure, telling people, yes, we support you. This is great. That's fantastic. You know what really supports someone for their resources? Money. Give your new DEI officer the money to build a team. Give them the money to support ERGs. Give them the money to help out recruiters and for hiring and for training. That's how you can show that support. And you can give people a lot of leeway, especially if they are experienced, especially if they're really hungry to do the work. Don't hamstring them, cut a check.
I think those are absolutely excellent points. The only couple of things I would add to that is, number one, business acumen. You don't want to bring people into that space who do not understand how the sausage is made, so to speak. And so that gives them credibility, for example, business acumen does. The second piece is change management. So they need to know how to facilitate a discussion, a group. When you put them in front of folks in a retreat, they should know what kinds of questions to ask and what kind of questions not to ask. They need to know when to hold their own opinions back and bring consensus in teams. Those kinds of things really matter when it comes down to pretty much anything in HR, but DEI for absolutely, I mean, in that area for sure.
Those are all great points, and I have nothing to add to this discussion. I agree with everything that was said so far. And my perspective is more from how would a company potentially evaluate us as a vendor, which I guess I could just dive into real quick. From that perspective is, we get a lot of questions. Are you a minority, female, veteran, disabled owned corporation? Yes or no? It does, it may or may not hurt us in the future, but we do get asked that a lot from the supplier diversity side of the house. And, we always want to create our teams in which that they are diverse, whether or not it's representation or not. It's diverse in backgrounds and experiences, levels of the organization, just so that we have a robust team presented to the organization as far as, like I said, degrees or experience, how many years of experience, levels of the organization. So we do keep an eye on that to make sure we have depth and something presentable to share back, because we know we're going to be asked. But certainly we put a lot of focus on experience and just depth within our teams.
Great. And then a topic that was covered at very high level up front was really this idea of, really getting the senior leader buy-in, because they do cut the checks, as we talked about before, or even getting the buy-in of the broader population, those individuals who don't perceive themselves to be the targets of D&I efforts. So one of the things that we've talked about really having to understand and deal with is the pushback around DEI and social justice within organizations, both at the leadership levels and broadly across the personnel population. Could we talk a little bit more about how to understand and deal with that pushback?
I think the pushback that we're seeing when it comes down to DEI, it's not new. I think we've had this pushback for a very long time. And one of the reasons, in fact, there are Pew polls that actually talk about people's perceptions about whether minorities are really adding to the American culture or subtracting from it. And in fact, a 2017 poll showed that less than a quarter of the majority population really believed that having more minorities within the United States is actually adding to the culture of the nation. And so we have a long ways to go. So we have a very long history of racial and ethnic prejudice. So that's not something which we can easily combat and break down in a day. And plus we also have other political sort of things that are happening. But I think within an organization, I think the key would be, this is what I'm thinking right now, folks. If I really knew the answer to this, I would be owning a small island somewhere. I'm living in it too, because Illinois is great, but not in winters. But I'm sort of thinking back to, two things. First is the notion of empathy. And I mentioned this earlier as well. And empathy is just sort of putting oneself in the other person's shoes, just trying to understand what that person is going through, their own experiences. And why are they processing data the way they are processing it? The kinds of questions that they're asking, where is that really coming from? And I think that's important to have. I think that empathy piece. The second piece is, again, I'm going to come back to this. And I think this is the third time I'm saying this, is change management. So kind of like any other change management, you have to get down to people's WIFM, what's in it for me. You really need to understand, why is it that people do what they do or resist change? And once you're able to get that, and every organizational context, there is something that is going to be unique in addition to what's common across different organizations. So going back and trying to identify what those issues are. Are those fears about being passed over for a promotion? Is this about the fact that you believe that somebody else is being heard a lot more than you were earlier? Those kinds of questions have to be understood in a much greater detail and tackled.
I can go next. So with this one, I agree with what you were saying, and that was kind of where I wanted to start as far as not everyone is going to have the same reason for pushback. So you're really going to have to figure out what's going on there. And it may be that it's different individual conversations or just some blanket statements put out there to cover these different areas. But I will go through 3 of the main things that I've really kind of seen. And one of those being, it's political, it doesn't belong in the workplace. And kind of a quick answer there is, your workplace does not exist in this magical bubble that doesn't live in society. So yes, it is in society, and your workplace is also in society. So this is something that your employees are having to live with every day. You can't ignore it. It does matter. It is in the workplace. It's already there. So it is something that matters, and bringing that to their attention. And then the next one is a lot of times that fear. And Mahesh, you touched on this a little bit. It's a fear of, how is this going to impact me? You know, if we're going to help this group, I'm losing out something, and getting into that zero sum game. And so explaining to them, it isn't zero sum. Just because we have to, you know, give a little extra here doesn't mean you're necessarily losing anything, doesn't mean you're going to be worse off. And also explaining the benefits that come out of it, you know. So one, you got to explain the difference between equality and equity. That's a whole other conversation. But 2 is, again, the benefit. So one example I like to throw out there is, let's say you have someone in your company who is deaf, they can't hear. And so you make it a standard that all of your, and we're virtual, right? So all of your virtual meetings have to have a transcript. And people are like, oh my gosh, I don't want to take the extra minute to set up this thing. We have one person, they're not even on my calls. Why does this matter? Well, you know, it's going to benefit that one person. And let's say for some reason they need it later on, it's useful to have it there. But aside from that, it's going to help your people on the team. If there's a transcript available and you have to download it and save it and provide it to every single employee after a call, now they don't have to take as much notes, right? Because the notes are already there. So this is something that, yes, it's benefiting that community, but it can benefit everyone. That is the heart of inclusion and equity when we're getting at it, is we want something, yes, to help the underserved, but it's to the benefit of all. So really just highlighting that is something that I like to do when we're getting pushback in that sense. And then the last one is cost concerns. And I'm going to be real quick on that, and just saying that no matter how expensive they think it is to bring in, you know, either external people or build an internal team, it is more expensive to have to deal with turnover, to have to deal with rehiring, to have to deal with low productivity because your teams aren't full. So cost concerns aren't real. Then they just need to rethink about what's going on there and figure out, you know, how would you rather spend your money? And I promise you, the, you know, $50K price tag on working with a consultant is better than having to spend so they'll say, like, depending on the study, you know, it's that person's salary is what you're losing when you have to replace them. That's more than what you're going to pay, you know, to just do this little bit of work. So those are 3 of the areas that I see pushback on, and just some quick thoughts I have on those.
Yeah, I agree with Mahesh and Satrice that a lot of the pushback that I am finding is really a lot about, what about me? What about me? Like, we're spending so much time talking about all of these other groups. I feel left out, and I feel like I'm not as important. And I get it, and I get that feeling of, well, shoot, I mean, all these people are going to get things that I'm not going to get. What is in it for me, as Mahesh has said beautifully all this time? And I think that is one of the underpinnings of how you override that pushback, is just reminding people what is in it for them. I like to tell clients, we're not lowering the bar, we're opening the door. And once you open the door, more people can come through. And now that you have more people in, better work, faster work, more interesting work, you win all the way around by opening the door wider.
Anyone else, anything to add? I will say the only regret I have about this session is that I didn't see the reactions button sooner. I would have had a lot more hand clapping emojis out there. What I will ask is we will now open this up to the audience Q&A because there are about 60 people still on the call. If we can do this by actually using the reactions button and raising your hand, I will do my best to go through in a timely fashion and call on you. So let's take a second and raise your hand if you have any questions for the panel. If you are camera shy for any reason, you're also welcome to send those questions through via chat. Martha, we got a hand.
Hi, so this is Martha. And first, thanks everybody for sharing all of your thoughts. I appreciate hearing your experiences and your background and everything that you talked about. I do have a question about, so we're in DC, and so many of us work for the federal government. And, you know, something that Sir Therese was saying about the focus on an individual and or a very small group of people. And so I have always thought about that as there are channels for people to bring their individual concerns to light. And I worry a lot about as scientists drawing conclusions about groups of people or changing practice based upon very, very small sample sizes and individual experiences. So I wonder if you could talk about your thoughts on, I agree it's absolutely important to take care of each individual person, but that seems like a different process than a research process and drawing reliable and valid conclusions about what's going on in the organization. So I'll just throw that out there. And maybe Sir Therese, you could speak first since my thoughts came from your comments.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I do want to clarify. So when I was saying small numbers, I didn't necessarily mean small overall. So I was referring to just small, like let's say you have 8, actually, this is an example of something I went through, right? There were 8 female Asian employees in the company, and all 8 of them responded and they scored poorly. And so that to me was a red flag, right? Because while 8 is a small number out of this, they had a few hundred employees, it was the entire population. So that is something to be of concern. But there is still, you know, there is still a minute, and we do still have to worry about sample size. So yeah, if it's a 20% response rate, then that's a different story. Maybe we shouldn't be generalizing, you know, that. So looking at response rate, that's a little different. I was just referring to, in general, your overall populations for these groups are going to be small, but that doesn't mean you should respond them. But yes, completely agree. You do need to be aware of, looking at that response rate and figuring out how representative is it of the population. And 100%, even for the large groups, you know, I'll pick on the straight white male, they need to have an individual method, right, of putting their concerns. So yeah, there should definitely be an individual way for people to go out and express if they feel like they're encountering some form of discrimination, and that needs to be housed somewhere where it's actually addressed. Thanks, Martha, for asking for that clarification. I see Trace has a hand raised.
Thanks, Therese. I was on mute.
You're good.
Thank you.
I'm able to go mute and actually ask my question. Hello, and thanks for doing this. This has been really informative. And, you know, I've just been wanting to educate myself. And Karen, I'm glad you posted this on your LinkedIn so I could see this is happening and crash the party. So my question is like about diversity that's less visible. You alluded to it earlier, whether it's, you know, neuro or, you know, GLBT, though apparently more visible than I think it is, maybe. You know, age in particular, like, you know, I have several years on most of my colleagues, and they display a lot of things in very small fonts, and I don't want to have to keep telling them to make it smaller for older eyes and, you know, call attention to it. So, you know, this is something that, you know, for my own diversity, you know, sometimes I have, you know, FOMO that it's not visible, and I'm kind of curious how that's something that's we're able to educate our colleagues and you know, friends in ERGs and such about.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. One, those are good questions to ask your DEI partner. How do they approach those things? Like where's their headspace when it comes to these vectors of diversity? As for what you can do or what your team can do, bring it up. A lot of folks don't realize that those are also vectors of diversity. And so everyone again is focused on the big three, or maybe, we may add in, age, but bring it up and say, this is where this is where my experience comes in. This is how this is helpful for me. And also using that example of like making the fonts larger for older eyes, that doesn't just help older eyes, that helps eye strain in general. And for as much time as we're spending on our computers reading and looking at things all day, increasing font size is just good for everyone. Talking about with age comes experience. And so, and I come out of the tech world. And so if you're, over the age of 30 in tech, you might as well be a dinosaur. But at the same time, a lot of us were around during ICQ and Angel Fire days. So we literally learned how to code when we were teenagers, which means that we're flexible and we know how to like pivot and make adjustments accordingly. And so sharing those experiences and those examples and leveraging that those are different ways that we can also bring diversity of experiences to the table can also help to open the door of, now we can start talking about all the different vectors that might be applicable to everybody in your team.
The examples are really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just do one quick add, Karen. I love how you mentioned bringing it up, because again, I think a lot of times employees feel like they don't have power if they're not in a certain position, and you do. And a lot of times they won't realize there is an issue until you bring it up. So going to whoever you report to, or if you're lucky enough to have an IND council, task force, something like that, going to them and saying, this is something you need. And I'm going to go one step further and say, employee resource groups are a magical thing. And if you have one that fits in line with what your concern is, going to them and having them develop something that's for allies to attend and learn about this, then that's great. If you don't have that ERG, again, going to your IND office and saying, I'd be interested in having one of these created. Employee resource groups are supposed to be employee-led. Most organizations, they won't create it unless an employee comes up and says they're willing to establish it and build that charter. So find some people, do some advertising, recruit, get that ERG made so you can have that support system for yourself and provide that information out to others.
Thanks.
Great. One question did come in through the chat. Before I ask that to the panel, I did just want to mention, and maybe Mahesh, this is a good place for us to plug the Passport event really quickly before I forget that you've asked me to do this. But if there are any NIU students who are in attendance, I will actually be sending out a QR code so you can get credit for the Passport event after this event. So at the end of the workshop that's facilitated by the McKinsey folks. And if for some reason you don't receive that from me, please just email me and I'll get it to you. Back to the questions. Yeah, no problem. Back to the questions. There is a question here. What are some recommended recruitment strategies to reduce bias and improve diversity in hiring and selection decisions? I think that might be an IO.
I'll go ahead and start it off, and then somebody else can jump. Karen, were you going to jump in?
Oh, no, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this one is a really good one. So some recommended strategies to reduce bias in the selection process is really understanding what your selection process is and training your recruiters and hiring managers on what the steps are and what's legally defensible as far as justifications and processes that are in place. Ensuring they have the training to disposition candidates appropriately as far as their outcome, like whether or not they pass the interview stage or pass the, got the offer. But some other strategies just in general from I'll stick with the selection outcomes. The selection decisions in general, always taking a retroactive look at it when you've made the selection decisions, kind of going back for the year-end review and doing those disparity analyses, looking at your bottom line analysis results and seeing if there are disparities where females get disproportionately screened out of a selection process in comparison to men. So we learn all this in grad school, right, in our industrial organizational psychology programs, but really then understanding at which step in the process that individual or group that's screened out, and going through the process of validating and justifying whether or not that is legally sound, or whether you're going to be not be able to hold your own in an audit with the government or in a complaint investigation. So doing those thorough analyses at a bottom line and then a steps component look to understand where your risk areas are, so you can, one, then improve the selection process that you have in place and switch out or improve that, so that you hopefully in time have the best selection process in place. But there are other tools, and I'll let my colleagues also speak that are on the panel. There are some tools and tricks that we've learned along the way that are helpful in just generally understanding what unconscious bias is and how that can impact your decision-making process. Potentially looking at resumes and information that doesn't have name information on it, that are a little bit more generic in what they look like. But that takes a systems approach, and that's a bigger company initiative that you would have to take to figure out how to mask that information. But really, from a best practice, and is really monitoring the outcomes and understanding if there is some type of adverse impact or concern with the selection process overall. Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I know all session long I've been talking about there isn't a checklist, but I'm actually about to give you a list. First thing, do not go to the places you always go to. If you're looking for IO Psych people, stop only going to IO Psych places. Go look at some sociology folks. Be clear about what you want someone to do, not necessarily what you want the title to be. That way you open the door to people who may be coming from different work experiences. If you're looking at your job description, send your job descriptions through something like Gender Decoder, so that your job descriptions aren't coded more masculine, because we find that if it's coded too masculine, women and non-binary people tend not to apply. If you're doing a hiring process, have a panel hiring process as opposed to having a single person. So that way you can have everybody talk about what those benefits are of that person. Have a standard process for your interviews, and that everybody follows that standard process for the interviews, whether it's a panel interview, whether it's whiteboarding, whether it's a project, whatever it is. Follow that standard for everyone. Make sure you have some place to put all of the interviews, whether it's Greenhouse or any sort of software, just so that it is transparent to everyone. When you are offering to someone, make sure you actually are offering in the range of what that job requirement is, and not, well, I think that so-and-so. Make sure it's standardized all the way through. So those are just some tactical things that you can do to actually bring more diversity into your hiring and selection process. But overall, it's stop doing the things that you're currently doing, expecting a different result.
Yeah, and I will tag on to that. I definitely think the job description review is important. What you're posting and how you're posting it and listing the information is critical, because it's your first impression. But also what other companies are doing is participating in employer index groups to say that they're a best practice employer for LGBTQ, that they are best practice employer for disability. And because they're going through the steps of demonstrating and sharing policies, procedures, information about their organization to then be ranked by these different indexes. And by being able to promote those, you're, one, showing that you're committed to it, you're going to be, and that you're going to attract that talent to your organization. So that's another strategy. I was focusing more on the eliminating bias in the selection decisions versus the recruitment, but there's a lot that you can do to put yourself out there to generate and attract diverse talent through those indexes as well.
I think we will go back to the questions, and thank you for flagging. Anna, you're up next with your question. Thanks for flagging that.
Sorry, I could have sent a crying, laughing emoji or a heart, but I don't have a hand. So sorry, but thank you. Thanks for the folks that tried to help me get there. My question is about, okay, so right now and for the past 18 months, we've largely been working in remote environments. And even as folks are going into maybe even hybrid scenarios or staying fully remote, either way, I would say, I'm just going to say most people are not going 100% back into the office with 100% of the folks who had been there before the pandemic. So like, how is inclusion going right now? How are people feeling? Do we have, that kind of information yet? And this follow-up is, what changes in the approach now that we don't have the same traditional structures in place and kind of indefinitely don't know when or if it will return in that sense. So just curious about your thoughts. I know we're all living in it right now, so we don't maybe not have the answers, but something I've been thinking about.
That's a good question. I know anecdotally, I've seen some things around about some experiences being better because since people are in their home environment, they do feel like they can be their authentic selves and bring themselves to work. And they're also getting to see others in their home environment. And so it's humanizing them a bit. And so I'll say that I know based on race, a lot of people are like, oh, I don't feel like I have to be on as much. And so they feel like that. And then also on the disability side, I was recently in a webinar and was hearing that a lot of them are feeling better because they have the systems they need in place at home to be able to fully thrive, and they're being able to get this work done more. So I won't rabbit hole us too much, but this is also to say that it's something to consider. A lot of businesses don't necessarily want to stay in this remote work life. They want to eventually go 100% full time, but it's important to consider if it's benefiting your employees and they're as productive or more than they are in the office, why not consider having a flexible hybrid work environment so people can choose? Some people may thrive and do better in the office. Some people may be doing better at home. So it's definitely, like you said, we're still living through it. So anyone who says they have all the answers right now are wrong. As you know, we need time to look at data over time. But anecdotally, what we've been seeing is there have been some actual improvements in these spaces from what I've seen, but I don't know if anyone wants to add.
I'd like to sort of present a slightly different perspective, and this really comes from telecommuting research. And what we're finding is that there is this idea of professional isolation. So when you telecommute, a lot of times you feel that you're not really in, you don't really know what's happening within the organization, what kind of conversations are happening, and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering whether this kind of a telecommuting context will actually, make inclusion even worse in organizations where diverse folks who are telecommuting are now even further distanced from the core or the center of the hub of activity. So that's one question. The other piece I sort of encountered as a professor teaching last year and a half is that when people turn on their computers, we also see their a lot of times when they're using screens, we sort of understand the conditions they live in. And many times our students are not very well off, not very wealthy. And that shows. And I'm wondering whether that really happens within the workplace too, when you are interacting with people who might not be really at very high levels in the organizations and don't earn big paychecks. And what kind of effect that background has on your evaluation of the person in terms of their traits as well as their performance. So those are a couple pieces I think we should sort of keep in mind as well when we're thinking of inclusion and telecommuting.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, however, and maybe I'm taking a slightly more optimistic approach to it, I think this is a wonderful opportunity. This is a great way of redefining how we approach work. That's fantastic that this gives us the opportunity and the space to think about what's best for our employees, what's best for us, what's best for productivity, what's best for happiness. The entire world is really, really intense right now. And so if we can do things to build more inclusion and build more happiness, and if that's remote, if that's in person, if that's a hybrid, we get the opportunity right now to shape what that looks like for us. And I think that that's just one of the coolest things ever. So play with it, see what works for your organization, change it up if you need to. Like Satrice said, we're in the middle of living in it. We're collecting data points right now. This is a perfect time for playing with those data points and seeing what works for everyone.
Thank you all for those responses. That was awesome.
Thanks for the question, Anna. Moving on to Crystal really quickly. My company started affinity groups last summer, but I'm curious what the next step should be.
If you don't mind coming off mute, could you elaborate a little bit on your question as far as outside of creating it, what's been put in place? How often do you meet? How many groups? And that can kind of help me direct you in the next direction.
Right. So they started last summer. The main one and the one that meets the most often, it's called BRAG. It's the Black, I think Black Rights Affiliation Group, I think is what it's called. And I would say once a month, they started like a book club and do different presentations on different topics. The last topic I remember was about colorism in the community and the workplace. But they're supposed to be starting one for young professionals, and then there's one called MC Light, which is really cute. It's a multicultural organization, and that the last meeting we had for that was around Christmas time, and it was just about the different celebrations in the workplace. Around the world, sorry. But I'm just curious, like, how is this, like, how it would progress once certain topics are hit? Like, what can be done next after, like, I guess the popular topics or the buzz?
No, yeah, thank you for elaborating. That's really useful. So a lot of affinity groups, employee resource groups, business resource groups, whatever you want to call them, were created initially as support systems. And so they exist and they have groups and they meet and they chat amongst themselves, or maybe one step over, they also have things for allies to come and learn a little bit, but it's much more of a social aspect. And so what's important is, one, to make sure your ERG was developed well. So having a charter in place, and in that charter listing out, who's responsible for what and what are your goals, and moving past just that social aspect if you really want it to have a strong impact. And also making sure that you have an executive sponsor, someone in top leadership, someone in your C-suite who is your advocate and can bring your issues up to the top. Also, something that's a little controversial and people are figuring out is making sure that your ERG has access to data. And that gets at making it to where they can have an impact on business. And so from there, it's bringing in, if you realize, we talked about a lot of analyses, right? Let's say you realize that you are not bringing in enough LGBTQ candidates. So going to them and saying, hey, this is the data that we saw. This is why we're coming to you. Can you help us with ideas on how we may be able to get some more people in? Are any of you willing to sit on these panels? So when we interview, they can see themselves represented. So that would say, that's my suggestion to you, to get to that next step with your ERG, is to move away from just the social aspect and education phase and into the business impact phase, and which parts of the business can benefit from you partnering with those departments to improve their efforts.
Very good. And then Dennis, you've had your virtual hand up for quite a while. I will pass the mic to you.
Thank you, panelists, for a very good discussion in terms of diversity and inclusion. My question goes into the voice, because a lot of numbers have been brought in terms of people, in terms of hiring. However, there is the kind of limitation in terms of the voices. How are they being heard within the organizations? Because it does do very little to the organization if the voices can never be heard. So what are your recommendations in terms of the actual listening to those diversities, not necessarily just marking the numbers as some people had said? Then additionally to that question is also in terms of the telecommuting. It is good telecommuting, but we have people who are going into organizations. So those we had a survey, for example, where those who are telecommuting were saying, oh, it's so good for us that we have a life balance. However, some of us who are going into the organizations, how does that feel for those who go into the organizations when others have to stay at home as they work? So what are some of your thoughts through those two questions? Thank you.
Well, I can at least, I'll start with the first one. I am a big fan of less formal channels of communication for ongoing communication. I'm a big fan of things like office hours, where you have leadership who's literally available, like, hey, Thursdays from 1 to 2, I'm available. If you want to come in and chat, let's come in and chat. If you're going to do office hours, however, there needs to be action behind it and not just listening, but office hours are great. Surveys are great, even though people can kind of burn out on surveys sometimes. I think that having your managers be an intermediary is a really great way of doing that too. So your managers can do things like stay interviews. Your managers can have one-on-ones and can then take those stories and pieces of information and move that up the pipeline also. So it's not just, well, I'm kind of yelling into the void. You now have an ally in your manager and your management team, even a skip level where you're like, hey, here are some things that are going on and I want to talk about it, or here are things I want to do and I want to talk about it. Having affinity groups and ERGs are also another great way of getting your voices heard within leadership. But the trick is that it is an ongoing conversation and not just a, well, we had a town hall or we had one session and we're done. As for kind of the telecommuting and those who are coming in and not coming in, kind of like we talked about before, I think ultimately the goal is what drives the most productivity and happiness of the organization. So for some folks, it absolutely is coming in because it's like, good, I can get away from the house and I can get away from this environment and be able to be fully on when I'm at work. For other people, there's so much more that happens when you have to go to the office that it drives down your productivity. So I think it, again, is important for the organization to leave both options open for folks so that however that hybrid model works, it's what is the most productive and the most beneficial for the members of the organization.
Yeah, I'll add on real quick to that. So for the first piece, I would say that it's important. Oh, my laptop might die. I'm going to move. It's important for you to make sure someone is accountable for this work. And that's why I say it's really useful if an organization can have an I&D office, because if someone is going to listen, right, and you're going to get these conversations, listening is one thing, but following up and acting on what you've heard is really, that's the key, right? And it's hard to track that sometimes. So that's one thing, is documentation. So documenting these conversations as the leader when people come to you, but also making sure that you, whoever had the initial conversation, document it as well, or ask for a copy of that so you have your own receipts, as they say. And then being able to then share that with the I&D office, being able to track that, right? So we had a conversation, this is the feedback, this is when it was acted on, this is when it wasn't. That's my key there is transparency and accountability and documentation. That's really important when we're listening. So just moving beyond hearing. And then on the remote work side, yeah, just wanted to reestablish there that it's important for the employees to have a say if possible. So having some standard options available, and then they choose the path that's best for them. So that way they're not forced into one area or the other. And I will say, there's always going to be some disconnect because there are some positions that 100% have to be in the office. For example, if you have chefs or a janitorial staff or custodial staff, right, they have to be in there. So it may need to vary by department. That's a method that some organizations have taken as well. And so you just have to be thoughtful, but like Karen was getting at, it's really specific to your organization. There's no one answer. You need to look and see what's going to work best for us and what's going to appear fair and equitable, and then actually communicating that with your employees. Hey, this is the plan that we think we want to do. What are some concerns you have? And getting their voice in that way as well, before just saying, oh yeah, we at the top who only have this one experience, we think this is what needs to happen. No, run it by everyone and get some input before putting those things in place.
Very good. I think we have time for one last quick question. I will ask Sasha if she's still on the line to come off mute. I see that you posted a question in the chat. If you could ask that, that would be really great.
Hey all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts today. I just had a quick question about intersectionality. Sorry, I just had to run to my phone real quick, so I'm a little out of breath. So for a lot of our clients, you know, they oftentimes want to look at these like main demographic groups, as we've talked about, as a couple of you have mentioned. And when we're looking at intersectionality, sometimes the data points or the end size is too small to look at. And so I just wanted some feedback on, sorry, I'm like really out of breath. I just wanted some feedback on thoughts or ideas about like emphasizing the importance of intersectionality. So for example, hiring people of color is certainly important, but what about their socioeconomic status? Are we hiring people of color from low income backgrounds, et cetera? So just wanted some thoughts on that. I appreciate it.
If I could just sort of give a sort of a broad answer to this, and I'm very curious to see what others have to say. What if we started to look at diversity as a resource as opposed to a deficit? So what if we started to think about these different backgrounds that people have as different kinds of resources people bring to the table? So now if a person is, let's say, female and Hispanic, or female, Hispanic, and belongs to the LGBTQ community, they have three different sets of experiences that they can bring along with being that person they are too, because let's not forget that every human being is a human being too. So if you bring those 3 + 1, 4 things to the table, how does that add to the value that the department, group, or organization is able to bring? I think that would be an interesting question. And if that was the conversation organizations were willing to have, I think we would start to see a lot more interest in the right kinds of measures around not just diversity, but also intersectionality.
And I think we also need to kind of go back to remember what intersectionality actually means. It's a term that's bandied about a lot, but it's the experience of what happens in the in-betweens. Like my experience as a Black person is one experience. My experience as a woman is one experience. My experience as a Black woman is different from both of those experiences. And so, like Mahesh said, if we're looking for that culture add, if we're looking for what those experiences are, you get a deeper experience looking at those intersections. So it can be a Black woman who grew up in a middle-class environment, who went to really good schools, who has a master's degree. That person, what is that person bringing to the table and bringing to the team? And I really want us to start thinking about the way that we think about diversity, to please divorce ourselves from just the check boxes of diversity. Please, let's start divorcing ourselves from that. Please, let's start looking at what can this entire person bring to the table? What can the Avengers concept bring to the table, that we're all bringing something together, that we're better together, and thinking about how we're moving our organization forward that way, as opposed to, well, I have this, I have this, I have this, I have this.
Very good. Well, please join me in thanking our expert panel. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Mahesh. Thank you, Sirtrice. Thank you, Kelly. I personally learned a lot. Even though we prepped and we talked a little bit about some of these topics, I learned about twice as much as I did in the prep. So you all are wonderful, like always. And I just appreciate you spending your evening or afternoon with us. We hope you'll come back to another event. In the meantime, we're going to take a quick break before we break off to the immersive learning experience. So if anyone needs to grab a water or anything else, feel free to do so. We'll come back in about 2 to 3 minutes. In the meantime, I am going to be switching hosting duties over to the McKinsey team. So that'll be Shannon Chang, Ruth Imos, and you have another guest as well that is joined.
Yep, and Davis Carlin will be joining us as well.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I will assign you both co-host duties now. And again, thank you to the panel. That was wonderful.